When asked, when did the Byzantine Empire fall? Most church historians will answer, in the year of our Lord, 1573, after the city of Constantinople was sacked by the legions of hell. Some might even add the quip that Varangians fled to New Antioch in the chaos, and pledged themselves to the Duke before the walls were completed, absorbed into the standing army of yet another pitiful story among many tragedies of humanity that they had to endure since the opening of Hell's Maw in the Levant. However, a few voices, yet fewer of them scholars, would mutter and murmur that Byzantium still lives on. Greetings, guardsmen and yeomen. Today we're going to be looking at the surviving forces of Trebizond, the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire within Anatolia, and perhaps the entirety of the once Grand Empire. Created by that evil one, these forces offer a pretty interesting look at some of the faithful nations and how they survive since the opening of Hell. So let's take a look into the history of Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire is a place of myth and mystery to many historians. It's not well known, despite coming up with many of the advances we see today, and many of the government structures as well. There's plenty of misconceptions about this nation as well, one of the biggest being its very name, Byzantium. The Byzantines never referred to themselves as the Byzantine Empire. In fact, they referred to themselves as the Roman Empire, because they were the Romans. Since the days of Caracalla and the splitting of the two emperors, these were the ancient empire's eastern provinces. Byzantium refers to the original name of the city of Constantinople. Captured by the Romans in their wars against Thrace, it was a major port city within the eastern provinces of the empire, and served as a regional capital. It kept the term Byzantium for many years, up until the days of Emperor Constantine. Emperor Constantine, upon winning the Civil War, moved his capital to the city, due to the loss of prestige of the ancient city of Rome, and he renamed Byzantium to Constantinople after himself. The people of Byzantium and the greater Byzantine Empire would refer to themselves as Romans even long after the empire's fall. In some cases, it was even up to the late 90s that people in these areas still refer to themselves as Romans first. But why does the term Byzantium still remain in heavy use today? Why do we refer to this period of the Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire? It actually comes down to Renaissance painters, poets, and historians. Many wanted to state that they captured the art of Rome, its culture, and rebuilt the ancient Roman ideals. This is also where we get the historical record that the Roman Empire was dissolved in the 400s AD with the Gothic sacking of the city of Rome and the collapse of the western provinces. These scholars, artists, and historians were a little embarrassed that the Roman Empire actually still was very much a thing throughout the entirety of the Dark and Middle Ages. So it was much easier for them, roughly 100 years after the actual fall of Constantinople, to just declare that these weren't the Romans, they were the Byzantines, a completely different governmental organization than the internal empire. There's also the added issue that many of these Latin states, particularly Venice, aided in the collapse of the Roman Empire itself, most notably during the disastrous Fourth Crusade, where under the guise of supporting a disgraced Byzantine prince, they besieged and looted the city, stealing much of its art and wealth. Venice. The Crusaders turning the city into a Latin Crusader state. The Byzantines were able to retake the city and much of their former empire, but it heavily weakened the nation, leading to its full collapse in 1453 during the siege of Constantinople. It was during this siege that the Byzantines sent many letters of aid to the Italian nations and other Catholic states. All of these fell upon deaf ears, with little more than thoughts and prayers being offered. The collapse of the city would lead to many scholars and historians fleeing to these Western nations, kickstarting the Renaissance. When it comes to the First Crusade, the Roman Empire played a major role in its formation. It would be their Emperor Alexios Komnenos that would formally request aid from Pope John Urban II. Komnenos was hoping for some Christian knights and mercenaries to assist the thematic armies in retaking Anatolia from the occupying Seljuk Turks, Anatolia being the Byzantine heartland. Pope Urban II readily agreed, as he thought this would be a way of reuniting both Orthodox and Christian churches together again, and a way of creating peace in Europe, uniting them under the banner of Holy Crusade. though Alexius would get much more than he bargained for, as the first Crusaders to show up were the People's Crusade. The People's Crusade, being an allegory for the trench pilgrims, were a bunch of medieval peasants hopped up on religious fervor. Many did not have weapons, and spent the several months they had traveling, absolutely raiding and pillaging Byzantine territory. Naturally, Alexius just sent them across the Bosphorus, where they were immediately surrounded and mostly destroyed by the Seljuks. He then had to deal with multiple Crusader armies, several of these forces being made up of men who got their experience fighting the Byzantines over Sicily, and many of these princes wanting little more than to take their own territories rather than to assist the Romans. Though Emperor Komnenos was extremely crafty, plying these men with as much gold as they can carry, in some cases entire rooms filled with treasure, and making them sign an oath that they would assist the thematas and togmatas, and not take Byzantine territory. Most would sign this. From there, the forces of Byzantium, both the professional soldiers of the togmata and the state militias of the themata, would assist crusading forces across Anatolia, culminating in the Battle of Nicaea, where we would see a masterclass in Roman engineering and siegecraft. The Crusaders had been laying siege to Nicaea for months. With a massive lake on one side of the city, they were unable to complete their encirclement, allowing the Seljuk garrison to receive constant resupply from ships on the lake. On the other hand, the Crusaders were slowly running out of food and time. The Byzantines, upon seeing this, were able to port an entire Byzantine naval fleet into the lake undetected, surprising both the Crusaders and the Seljuk garrison, and using a landing force of both Byzantine Marines and Varangian Guard, take over the city, though this was mostly down to a deal struck with the Seljuk garrison. The Crusaders wanted to capture and completely loot the city. This being a regional capital of the Byzantine Empire, the Romans did not want this, and the Seljuks didn't want to die, so the deal was easily struck. The Seljuk garrison could simply leave and give up the city to the Byzantines. When the Crusaders awoke that morning, they found the city covered in imperial flags, and they couldn't enter the city without heavy Roman escort. The Byzantines would play more logistical and support roles for the Crusades from then on, remaining mostly in Anatolia fighting off the Seljuks, and defending their own territories, rather than assisting them into the Levant. But Komnenos would send a relief army to Antioch. This relief army would run into one of the deserting Crusader lords on the roads, who told them that pretty much everyone was dead and the cause was lost. The general, not wanting to waste his own men on what he was told was a lost cause, simply packed up and head back to Anatolia. Though the Crusaders would survive this siege through some miraculous victories, and would reach the city of Jerusalem, taking the city, and within Trench Crusade, opening up the Hell Portal and starting the Cataclysm. Little is known of the Byzantines past 1099, though we can assume they were in a much stronger position than in our own timeline. For one, the invading Seljuk Turks were getting their homelands absolutely bodied by demons, so this would allow the Romans to retake their heartland. I wouldn't put it past them taking advantage of the situation. From there, they would help to fortify Antioch and defend faithful territory. The Fourth Crusade and the destruction of Constantinople never occurred, so it is safe to assume that the Byzantines provided direct assistance in the Year of the Three Battles and in the Corpse Wars against Beelzebub. The Byzantine borderlands would be the major front of the Crusades until 1545 and the destruction of the city of Antioch by an unknown infernal weapon. From there, the demonic forces would steamroll Anatolia, resulting in the destruction of the city of Byzantium, interestingly enough not being named Constantinople within Trench Crusade, in 1573. This would be the official destruction of Byzantium and the Roman Empire. Their internal empire lost to the annals of history, barring a few survivors of the Varangian Guard making their way to New Antioch, pledging their services to the city. Though unknown to most, the hastily crowned Roman Emperor, his surviving family, the Togmata, and much of the Varangian Guard and city defenders would make their way to the theme of Chita, the last surviving part of Anatolia and the city of Trebizond, rebuilding its painted walls and keeping the eternal flame of Rome alive into the modern day of Trench Crusade in 1914. The fall of the city of Constantinople and the collapse of the Byzantine Empire happened almost a century earlier in our own timeline in 1453, when Constantinople was seized by the Ottoman Turks. though the origins of Trebizond are much earlier, with the horrendous event known as the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was another attempt to retake the Holy Land for Christendom, though it ran into many problems along the way, most notably the complete lack of funds and ships. This crusade was already fresh off of completely destroying the city-state of Zara in order to get the Venetians on board to ply them with ships. But here they were, completely out of money again, nearing the city of Constantinople. There they were approached by an exiled Byzantine prince, one whose noble family had fallen out of favor. He plied the Crusaders with a bunch of gold and promises of wealth if they assisted him in retaking his throne. Now, would these Crusaders forego their holy mission and betray their oaths not to attack Christians or their territory to actually defend these lands? To besiege the most holy city of all of Orthodox Christianity and the second most important city of all of the Catholic Church? The eastern capital of Christianity and one of the most famous cities in all of the world? Just for a little monetary gain? The Crusaders proceeded to lay siege to the city. After several months of siege, capturing it, absolutely sacking it for almost a week, and installed the Byzantine prince on the throne. They then proceeded to extort this prince for all the money he had. The prince realized he was royally screwed. There was not enough money left in the city to pay off the Crusaders, especially not after the sacking. The prince made every attempt to pay off the Crusaders, emptying out the treasuries and armories, destroying statues, selling off artwork, and even melting down the famous frescoes for gold bars. These actions are why we don't see that much Byzantine artwork and weaponry in museums. It destroyed hundreds of years' worth of ancient Roman and religious artworks. Don't you just love religious fanatics? But even after all these actions, it still was not enough to pay off the Crusaders, who demanded even more money. The prince, pushed to his limits, staged a rebellion against the Crusaders, who did not take too kindly to this, shattered his rebellion, killed him, and massacred the city, sacking it again, and turning it into a Latin Crusader state. These actions shattered the Roman Empire, breaking the remaining Roman territory into successor kingdoms, most notably the successor kingdom of Trebizond, forming in 1204 with its own independent government under Alexios I, who had crowned himself Megas Komnenos, or literally Great Komnenos, and modeled himself after the Roman emperors. The territory of Trebizond stretched from the state of Sinope through several themes and into modern-day Georgia, with territory as far as Crimea, straddling the Black Sea along the northern Anatolian mountain ranges. It would survive relatively peacefully after the recapture of Constantinople by the Nicaean dynasty, and afterwards the Trebizond dynasty would completely forego its claims to the imperial throne and rejoin the empire. Trebizond would even go on to outlive the empire itself, surviving past the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottomans. It would live on until 1461, when the Ottomans were able to successfully besiege and take the city. The fall of Trebizond represented the fall of any official power of Rome, and the last of its light to be snuffed out. The Trebizond of Trench Crusade appears to have a very similar history to that of our royal timeline, though remained part of the imperial throne for its entire period. The sacking of Constantinople by the Latin Crusaders and the dissolvement of the empire for several decades never occurred, so the successor kingdom never formed, up until the destruction of Byzantium in 1575. There, the surviving nobility of Byzantium, along with its military and Varangian Guard, would either head to New Antioch, or the vast majority, flee with a hasty crowned emperor to the city-state of Trebizond. And they would join the thousands of other refugees making their way to the theme of Chita, Chita being the theme that encompassed Trebizond. From there he would begin to reform his empire and its armies, filled by refugees of both Muslim and Christian faith, escaping the heretics from across Anatolia. Through bloodshed and faith, they were able to keep this remnant of the old empire alive, developing walls and extensive defensive networks, and making heavy use of the meager land and sea resources that they possess. Though Trebizond remained on a knife's edge, its population far outpacing the amount of food that they could produce, only brave traders from the Iron Sultanate managed to keep the city alive through convoys braving the defenses and reaching the city. So appreciative of these efforts, Trebizond erected a Muslim quarter within the city. By the year of 1914, Trebizond has been cut off from the rest of Christendom for over 300 years, though with the fighting around New Antioch intensifying, the siege around Trebizond has begun to wane. The constant battles that would brace up against the painted walls of Theodosia have dwindled to a trickle. Sea raids are near non-existent upon the Black Sea, and heretical patrols have thinned enough for convoys to re-reach the city from the Iron Sultanate. With these developments, the commanders of the themes of Chita, the militant arm of Trebizond, began to draft up plans to break the siege, to finally re-reach their Christian brothers after 300 years of isolation. The themes of Chita are the militant arm of Trebizond, with a tradition stretching back before the Gate of Hell blighted the Holy Earth. Its ranks of Federodii are filled with Christians and Muslims alike, and its officer corps is staffed with the graduates of the Schola Varangius, with a few of the original blood still remaining. But with traditions kept alive and well, they serve the will of their ruler. Now let us take a closer look at these themes and the types of soldiers they bring to the field. The forces of Trebizond come from what is known as the theme of Chita. What exactly are themes? Themes are essentially Roman states. Think like the United States or the Federalized States of Germany, where they would develop more localized laws and command centers and logistical hubs compared to just having the federal government control everything. This even comes down to military forces. This all came about during the thematic reforms in the middle of the Byzantine Golden Age. There they would split up the imperial control, with the main command centers within Constantinople and localized governments handling localized threats. They would form what is known as the thematas. The themata was the militia soldiers brought up to defend the theme. Think like the National Guard that we have in the United States today. These thematas would work in conjunction with the actual standing Byzantine army stationed within Constantinople, known as the togmata. These would be your Varangian Guard, elite Cataphracts, and the like. For recruitment to these thematic armies, each 10 plots of land or 10 families must be able to equip at least one horseman or soldier. Most middle-class Byzantines who could afford it would be able to equip at least one Cataphracti, or simply armored horseman, to be used within the Byzantine army. This served as their land tax to the Byzantine government, and it really depended on the size, population, and wealth of a particular theme on what soldiers are recruited and how many soldiers. Many times you could have one theme producing Cataphract regiments in their hundreds, while others are only having a few dozen archers. Many of these thematic armies would even be almost family groups. Many soldiers who could actually see their older family members as their officers. This tied them heavily to defending the land from invasions and serving the nation. So let's get into the different types of soldiers that make up a thematic force sent into the field by Trebizond. The standard infantrymen of the warbands of Trebizond is that of the Federodii. The Federodii come from the ancient Roman word of fortis, the fortis being a treaty between two states for mutual defense, a way of internal friendship between ancient tribes, and were used throughout the Roman Empire even into the earliest days of the First Roman Republic, with the earliest fortis being forged in 493 BC. Though it should be stated that much of the autonomy awarded to these tribes was heavily limited and degraded over time, it was still a mutual defense pact. Should these tribes come under threat, the Roman Empire would assist, and vice versa. These fortresses required these allied states to provide a certain amount of men, depending on the treaty. These men would be known as Federodii. The Federodii system existed within the Roman Empire all the way till the collapse of Constantinople, with many of the themes relying on Federodii soldiers to assist. Within Trench Crusade, Trebizond heavily relies on these Federodii to fill the ranks of their warbands. Millions of refugees flooded into the theme of Chita to escape the marauding heretical forces. As Anatolia burned, Trebizond remained. As part of the deal for their families finding food and shelter behind the walls, these refugees, coming from both Muslim, Christian, and even pagan origin, would serve in the army as foederodii. The foederodii themselves operates on a rotating schedule, either defending the walls, going out in warbands or in rest, or assisting in both farming and fishing, to supply the rest of the 2/3. And the foederodii in battle have access to the entire arsenal of Trebizond, with men being seen with bolt-action rifles, shotguns, to even automatic rifles and submachine guns, and supplement the more thematic forces that defend the city. No discussion into the warbands of Trebizond and the greater thematic forces of the Byzantine Empire could be complete without mentioning the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard was a mercenary group personally recruited by the Emperor, and served as both his bodyguards to the royal families, protecting specialized locations across the city of Constantinople, most notably the Hippodrome and the Hagia Sophia. They had also become a major core to the Roman thematic armies, serving as elite shock troops and even a makeshift coast guard for the Byzantine navy. They were known to be the first to jump into battle, and the first to gain the rights of plunder of their enemies. Known for their ferocity, but for loyalty above all. They would serve faithfully throughout the Byzantine period, from their initial founding to the collapse of Constantinople in 1453, with almost no signs of rebellion or betrayal of their imperial lieges, barring one occasion when the captain of the guard killed the emperor and usurped the throne, though it ended up actually working out for the Byzantines in the end, so that was kind of a moot point. But overall, they served with great honor and distinction, unlike their Praetorian Guard predecessors, who would betray the emperor for as little as 20 denarii and a gift card to Little Caesars. Most Varangians never had a reason to betray the emperor. They had no real aspirations for political power within Byzantium, and the emperor paid them extremely well, and gave them opportunities to gain battlefield experience. Many Viking warlords actually had their starts in the Byzantine Empire as Varangians. Most notably, Rollo the Wanderer started life as a Varangian Guard, gaining battlefield experience and much of his wealth. Rollo would not be alone. Many men came from Scandinavian origins to serve in the Guard, with most coming from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. But it was not the rule, and there were men from all across Europe, North Africa, and even the Middle East. It was stated that men from both the Cross, Hammer, and Moon Crescent served within the ranks of the Varangian Guard. One example was Anglo-Saxon survivors from the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Herskiles, chafing under Norman rule, fled to the Byzantine Empire and pledged their service to its emperor. They were joined by men from Germany, Spain, France, Italy, the North African states, and even Armenia. And hilariously, other Normans, as Norman soldiers from Sicily also took the oath of protecting the imperial throne. Though the origins of the Guard and much of their long-term recruits lies with a former Viking tribe from the lands of modern-day Belarus and Ukraine, the Kievan Rus. The origins of the Guard are actually pretty funny, and it all begins with the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus, having traded along the rivers of modern-day Ukraine, eventually would reach the Black Sea. Traversing it, they would reach the Bosphorus and spy the city of Constantinople. There, songs and sagas would deem the city as Myminifactory, a place of grand cathedrals, gold-lined streets, and citizens covered in jewels, where even the poor looked rich. Naturally for the Vikings, they thought, yeah, we can take that. Now, this is not the brightest move, but you can't doubt the determination of these Rus Vikings. This is not Lindisfarne, with a bunch of unarmed monks, or isolated Irish villages. This is Constantinople, one of the most defended cities of all the ancient world, with a 3-tiered walled defensive system guarded by thousands of professional soldiers and a professional naval force. A naval and defensive force armed with some of the most advanced weapons ever seen in this period of history. Chiefly enough, grenades and Greek fire throwers. In an era where all the ships are made of wood. As you can probably guess, it did not end well with the Vikings. With their long ships burning in the Bosphorus, and thousands of their men dead, the survivors limped back to their territories in Ukraine. The Vikings, not knowing the definition of insanity, decided to raid Constantinople again. In fact, they would do this over 6 times. each time ending exactly the same way as the first one: burned ships and dead men floating in the Bosphorus. These raids did a little bit more than just annoy the Byzantines, who eventually decided to forgo the lessons learned and give a mouse a cookie, and began paying off the Vikings. This, of course, did not work, as they returned the very next year for more money, and if not paid, attempting to raid the walls again. While these raids could be considered quite stupid, it did do one thing well for the Vikings: prove that they were some of the best fighters known to the ancient world, with their tenacity and ferocity impressing the Byzantines, who came up with another plan to get rid of them for good. Approaching the ruler of the Kievan Rus at the time, Olga of Kiev, an attempt to bring her into the empire by marrying her to the Byzantine emperor to allow them to usurp their territory. Though Olga is a queen of subterfuge and managed not only to avoid the marriage, but the seizure of her territory, by simply getting converted first and stating that we're now a Christian nation, you can't conquer us, or marry her. The Byzantine emperor, surprisingly, was not angry about this and agreed to the alliance. As part of this alliance, the crown prince of the Kievan Rus, along with a warband of some of the best fighters of their people, made their way to Constantinople and pledged their service directly to the Roman emperor, pledging to be a loyal bodyguard. So in the end, the Kievan Rus did make it past the walls of Constantinople, but became its protectors rather than its conquerors, forming the first Varangian Guard. Within the world of the Trench Crusade, the Varangian Guard's origins are not too dissimilar from our own timeline, and within Trebizond, they serve as the main backbone of their warbands. Many still hold genetic lineage to those of the original Varangian Guard, with many men of Ukraine and the Scandinavian nations braving the Black Sea in heretical patrols to join the siege. There's actually a split between those that left for New Antioch and pledged service to the Duke, and the men of the Varangians that remained loyal to the Byzantines. In fact, many of these original lineages do not like their brothers in New Antioch. The service of the Guard has continued on into 1914, with thousands donning the red and black of the Varangians. They serve as elite bodyguards, never far from the side of the Roman Emperor, and as skilled sailors, the backbone of the defensive fleets of Trebizond and the Black Sea, and of course, as ferocious shock troopers, wielding their famous Dane axes as they charge headlong into battle, cleaving heretics in two. Forever at the forefront of Trebizond warbands, they will not rest until Anatolia is back in Roman hands. The Guard's internal service, never ending. The final of the major units that we'll talk about with Trebizond is that of the Cataphract. Also known as Cataphractos or Cataphractoi, they were the bread and butter unit of the Byzantine Empire. During the thematic reforms, the Byzantine Empire moved to a more cavalry-based unit, rather than your standard infantry of the ancient Romans, hence the creation of the Byzantine Cataphract. Cataphract, literally meaning armored horseman, had its origins in ancient Parthia and Iran, though they were quickly copied by the Romans after facing them multiple times, with the first units being nothing more than auxiliary units from Parthia itself, though it would be the defeat at Nildis in 217 that placed importance of making the Cataphractoi part of the mainline army. The Cataphractoi would be served as the precursors to the medieval knight, and served the Byzantine Empire faithfully for many years, with many of these units of Cataphractoi becoming heroes of the realms due to victories in 503 and 512 AD respectively. The Cataphractoi would probably be one of the most recognizable units of the Byzantine Empire, with them themselves and their horses covered in head-to-toe in laminar plate, gambesons, and special chainmail headgear that covered their faces entirely. Armed with shields and lances, they were premier shock cavalry. Recruitment into the Cataphractoi mostly came from Byzantine middle class, with the same thematic systems where multiple landholders would come together to arm at least one Cataphractos. While mainly serving as the core of the Themata's armies, many Cataphractoi units would even earn the honor of serving the emperor directly in the Togmata, with records showing several named units of Cataphracti serving in the emperor's personal guard. In Trench Crusade, the spirit of the Cataphract lives on into 1914, with the Cataphract mechanized infantry. These are an answer to a major problem the Trebizond forces faced: Being under siege for decades with their land and sea routes blocked, they didn't have access to the same amounts of fabrication and materials to create the heavy mechanized infantry seen within New Antioch and the rest of Europa and North Africa. To answer this problem, Byzantine armorers came up with a lighter, easier to fabricate version of the machine armor. While not providing the same level of protection of that of the heavy mechanized infantry, it was highly maneuverable and still allowed the wearer to wield machine guns, heavy flamethrowers, and grenade launchers with ease. The armor was also highly customizable, allowing the wearer to switch from a fire support version to that of a heavy melee variant. The mechanized Cataphract continued the service of their ancestors, being the backbone of Trebizond warbands as they fight to retake Anatolia. Now there's actually one major part of the Byzantine Empire that we haven't really discussed, and that being the myriad of technologies that the Byzantines were able to develop. Most famously among these are Greek fire. Greek fire is an incendiary concoction that literally could not be put out by normal means, especially at the time that it was deployed. The Romans would use this in multiple different forms, from incendiary grenades to literal flamethrowers. We have multiple artist depictions of what would have been these flamethrowers, both on naval vessels and as portable single-man units. Currently, historians are still very split on exactly how Greek fire was made. The most prevailing theory is a mixture of olive oil and some other incendiary chemicals that made the fire water solvent. It's also no surprise that this was an extremely dangerous weapon to use. You're literally using a form of napalm with no known way of turning out the fire. Mishandling of the weapon could lead to an explosion, or the fire hitting their own ship or defenses, or blowing back straight into the operator's face. Not ideal. Greek fire still makes heavy use within the warbands of Trebizond, particularly as incendiary grenades and for use in their flamethrowers. As stated within the lore, Greek fire is prepared with an ancient recipe passed on even long after leaving their home. The remnants of Byzantium use their own mixture to fill thrown heavy ordnance. Rather than explode with debris and shrapnel, the searing hot fire engulfs the target in flames that refuse to be easily doused, clearing out trenches with their own napalm grenades, evening the playing field with the heretics. The warbands have even been seen making use of something known as phosphorus shells. As stated, created by filling the shells with ground-up remnants of artillery witches sanctified with communion wine, Byzantine shotgunners can hit their targets with flames that burst through even the most robust of defenses. These are the same as modern-day dragon breath rounds, an incendiary shotgun round that's more used as a novelty than anything else, with no real military purpose. Though in the confines of a Trebizond defensive structure, or in the casemates of a heretic trench line, these dragonfire rounds can be used to great effect. But this is not the only thing that we can thank the Byzantines for. The Romans weren't just responsible for weapons development. Construction methods, irrigation, and much more can be credited to the Byzantines. One of the most notable things is that of a defensive network known as the beacons. If you've ever seen Lord of the Rings and Gondor calling for aid, that actually comes originally from the Byzantines. They developed a sequence of towers that would be lit the moment an enemy force was spotted upon the periphery, and in under an hour, the beacons would warn the thematic forces within Constantinople of the invasion. The Byzantines also play a major role within the historical preservation of the First Crusade. Emperor Comnenus' daughter Anna being one of the first real historians, and her records of the courtly life and of the Crusader lords provides one of the most accurate depictions of the First Crusade that we have known to record, establishing modern historical study. The technological and defensive mindsets of the Romans have not degraded within this small territory of Trebizond. Simply look at the painted walls of Theodosia and the weapons and armor that they wield, and the heirs of Rome have continued on their traditions. When looking at the weapons and armor of the Byzantine warbands, it's heavily reflected that they've been under siege for decades. When it comes to their armor, they're seen using a lot of the same laminar plate mail and scale mail that were famous across Byzantine artwork and that of the later Roman period. They were extremely advanced armor sets and provided the wearer a lot of protection. Most notably is the chainmail hood, which would cover the entirety of the wearer's face. One part of the armor that is quite interesting is the use of either the Montefertino helmet or a variation of the Ridge helmet. The Montefertino helmet was a helmet design that was extremely popular during the Roman Republic era. Originally coming from Gallic nations, the Romans adopted it for their Republic forces. Most notably, the Principes and Hastati make heavy use of this helmet. Though it would eventually come out of favor for the Gallic helmet and many other helmet designs during the beginning of the Imperial era. The Ridge helmet, on the other hand, was a more cheaply made helmet designed for the armies of the 3rd century Crisis and the later Roman period. Still providing adequate protection, they were easier to produce and were much simpler. Both of these helmet designs would be out of place for the Byzantines, as they would switch them out for more kettle helms, skull caps, and other forms of conical and round helmets, more typically of the period. When it comes to the weapons seen among the Trebizond forces, it seems to be a mix of imports of Italian, French, and Russian designs, along with a few in-house productions. This makes sense, as they've been under siege for decades, though the occasional aid convoy from the Iron Sultanate and Varangian Guard force would be able to break through heretical lines, which would allow for these designs to make their way into Trebizond hands. It appears that the forces of Trebizond make heavy use of Russian-produced firearms, though in this case probably Ukrainian or Novgorodian-produced weapons, and it makes sense, as they are one of the few locations that could actually provide support to the beleaguered city. And they make heavy use of these firearms, most notably the Mosin Nurgant. The Mosin Nurgant appears to be Trebizond's standard-issue rifle, seen heavily among the Federodii forces. The Mosin was the standard-issue rifle of the Imperial Russian military, and would see heavy use throughout the First World War, the Russian Civil War in both the Red and White armies, with heavy use in World War II and the Winter War. The Mosin remains in Russian service even into the modern day, with some Russian Federation backmarker units being issued with Mosins. Notably within Trebizond, we see both the standard-issue bolt-action rifle and the sniper variation being seen among the warbands. Though this is not the only Russian firearms seen among Trebizond forces. The forces of Byzantium make heavy use of the Fedorov Automat as their automatic rifle. Designed by Russian Army officer Fedorov in 1913, it became one of the first automatic rifles to be fielded in the war, though it was mostly fielded as a light machine gun with a two-man crew, and interestingly used Japanese Arasaka rounds as its main ammunition, provided in stripper clips, as it would only be issued with one magazine. It would see sporadic service during World War I, rushed into service for the Kerensky Offensive, and heavy use during the Russian Civil War. It would be phased out for standardization efforts during the Soviet Union, though it would be brought back during the Winter War due to the shortage of automatic weapons. Other notable designs was that of the M18 Beretta. The M18 was created out of a failed aircraft machine gun and would be combined with an Italian Carcano rifle and some other spare parts to form a pretty effective submachine gun. The MP-18 would see service with the Arditi, and 3 separate variations were produced during the war, including a fully automatic variation. The M1918 would prove so effective that they actually ran out of parts to make these weapons, and would see service all the way up into the Italian fronts of World War II. The one seen with Trench Crusade appears to be more of the M2 variation, which was designed later in the interwar period. We can also see a mixture of what appears to be civilian-made weapons, and even some in-house designs. Most notably, the Byzantine shotgunners are seen wielding what appears to be some variation of either the 1901 or 1887 Winchester shotgun. These were civilian-made hunting shotguns with a lever action, though could probably be easily transported by Iron Sultanate convoys, hence their use among Trebizond. We also get quite an interesting variation of a submachine gun. The closest real-world comparison I could find was that of the Smith & Wesson Model 76, a submachine gun designed for the Vietnam War, though it would see limited service due to its poor quality, and would even find service in the Panamanian Defense Force in Saudi Arabia. Another in-house design that we can see is that of the Sochaux machine gun. This was a French machine rifle and one of the first light machine guns / automatic rifles of the war. And it makes sense for use in Trebizond, as it was made out of stamp parts and meant to be as cheap and easy to produce as possible. Developed by a French bicycle company, yes, you heard that right, it was designed to be a light, easy-to-produce machine gun for the French military. And despite its advancements as one of the first machine rifles, the gun was ill-suited for the trenches. The magazine had holes cut into sides to allow for the gunner to see how many rounds were left, though if you know anything about World War I, you can see the issue as mud would gum up the bike spring used to feed the rounds. Yes, you heard that right, an actual bike spring. There was also the issue of the charger handle of the weapon flying back and hitting the gunner in the face if he was too close, providing the gunners what is known as the Sochaux kiss. When provided the lighter French ammunition, the gun actually performed rather well, though the main issues started to arise when it was modified for the American Expeditionary Force. As part of the modification, it was designed to handle the 30-06 round that was standard issue among American forces. The only problem is that its parts of the Sochaux could not handle this, and would break apart in the gunner's hands if fired for prolonged periods. There was also the added issue of the French arms manufacturers having no idea what the imperial system was, leaving the barrel to be an improper width, meaning that rounds could simply just break apart within the barrel. Not ideal, especially when they could just explode in the barrel. These issues would lead to the Sochaux being phased out for the Browning automatic rifle as soon as it was available. Though when it comes to melee weapons, two heavily stand out among the warbands of Trebizond. One famous among the Varangian Guard, the Dane Axe. The Dane Axe was the standard issue weapon of both the guards of the Emperor and the shock troops. A guardsman seen wielding his Dane Axe was one of the deadliest weapons on Earth, with many guardsmen bringing these axes with them on their journeys to the Empire, and would pass them down to their sons as they joined the force, with many Dane Axes being hundreds of years old by the time of the disillusionment of the Guard, with this process more than likely continuing into modern-day Trebizond in 1914. Another weapon making heavy use is that of the polearm. Polearms, such as halberds and spears, made heavy use within the thematic armies after the thematic reforms. Particularly after being shifting to a more cavalry base with their lances, the infantry mostly became phalanxes and pikemen, to better defend the territory of the Empire from ongoing threats. And it is stated that even today, the forces of Trebizond make heavy use of the pike and are extremely skilled with it in melee combat. And with that, we've reached the end of our discussion with Trebizond and the wider Byzantine Empire. We've discussed their units, their backgrounds, and of course their weapons and armor. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I apologize for being a little later on this release. August was just a little busy there for me, and trying to get everything together. There's a lot to research when you're talking the entirety of the Byzantines and many of their units. So I hope you guys enjoyed and weren't too off-put by the amount of history revealed there. I'm going to keep on with the Trench Crusade stuff, but I will also get into researching more outside of this universe to other factions and universes. So keep an eye out for that. I'm looking at getting back into 40k a bit, and also branching out into, say, Fallout and a few other stuff. Particularly the NCR. I found a lot of connections to World War I just through their uniforms very recently. So if you guys enjoy that, please subscribe and keep an eye out for those. If you have any ideas or wants for what to go forward and factions to cover, don't hesitate to leave a comment. So again, thank you guys for sticking with me and being patient with this release and enjoying it if you made it this far. You guys have a great night, day, whatever it is, because I gotta get back to the archives. Have a great one.